Well, I'm glad to see everybody this morning. It is the first Sunday of the new month, which is why I'm wearing this suit jacket. It's not really a suit jacket. I think they call it a sport jacket. I've heard people describe it as looking a little bit like a lounge singer's jacket. That's okay. That's okay. I feel like, what's his name? The Hawaiian singer, Don Ho, a little bit. But this is my jacket in honor of Hawaiian First Sunday. And so instead of a Hawaiian shirt, I'm wearing a Hawaiian jacket. And all I can say is thank you, DXL, Men's Big and Tall Store. Thank you for your 75% off sale, in which I felt justified in buying this jacket. But anyway, hey, I'm participating. You'll probably, if you see me on Sunday morning, you'll probably see me in this same jacket with this same white shirt underneath. Anyway, let's get started. I've got Terry and Lucretia Burton, Paul Reed, and Victor Martinez with me today. We're going to be studying Titus. I'm going to start off with kind of an introduction to the book, and then we're going to get into chapter 1, and we're going to have some discussion about chapter 1. But before we get into the actual scripture, I just wanted to give a little bit of background on Titus. Titus, the man, we don't really know a lot about, but I think we can assume he was very influential in the early church, probably was very close to Paul. Our first introduction to Titus occurs when he accompanied Paul to Jerusalem when they were dealing with the Judaizing issue. You know, a lot of the Jewish Christians were requesting that Gentiles, or requiring Gentiles, to be circumcised if they were going to become Christians. And from Galatians chapter 2, verse 3, we know that Titus was in this group that went with Paul to address that issue. Ultimately, as you guys probably know from your study of Acts, they eventually reached the decision after consultation with church leaders and the elders there in Jerusalem that circumcision would not be necessary for these Gentile Christians, which was a big deal because Titus was a Gentile. We next kind of see Titus in relationship to the church in Corinth. 2 Corinthians chapter 8, Titus is featured prominently there. We know that Titus had just come from Corinth and had met up with Paul. And he had given a good report. Essentially, it looks like Titus probably went to Corinth after they had received the letter that's called 1 Corinthians. They had hopefully made some changes, because if you're familiar with 1 Corinthians at all, that church looks like it was really messed up. You know, it looked like it was really a messed up church. And Titus had a really positive feedback to Paul about what had happened with the church in Corinth. And then we find out that Paul was sending Titus back with the letter that would become 2 Corinthians, with the instructions to help them continue on with their work, their collection for the needy in Jerusalem. That was kind of the instructions that Titus had been given. Now, sometime later, probably several years later, after Paul's first imprisonment in Rome, it looks like Paul and Titus went to Crete together. And that kind of sets us up where we are in relationship to the book Titus that we're about to study in detail. Evidently, Paul and Titus had traveled there to help establish churches and to check in on the churches there. And when Paul left, he left Titus behind. And that's where we pick up with the book here in Titus. Now, later in his life, we know that Titus and Paul hooked up again. Titus left Paul, went to Dalmatia to evangelize. Dalmatia would be Yugoslavia, modern day Yugoslavia, specifically Serbia and Montenegro.
And Croatia.
What's that?
And Croatia.
And Croatia, that's right. But I think Dalmatia specifically is Serbia and Montenegro. And eventually, a tradition tells us that Titus probably returned to Crete, where he retired, which I think is something all of us want to do, right? Retire on an island in the Mediterranean. I see Victor shaking his head aggressively. I know he spent time in Cyprus, I think, which is another island.
Crete. I spent 2.5 years in Crete.
Oh, okay. Well, then this book's special to you.
It is. I even traveled to the supposedly the first church that Paul established there with Titus.
Well, then we may circle back around to you when we read about Paul's assessment of the Cretans. And it's not real positive. So you may have some firsthand experience with that here in chapter 1. Okay. The kind of shift anyway, that's basically all we know about Titus. There's not a lot of additional information there, but he does seem like he was a hard worker for the Lord. He was good friends with Paul. He's referred to by Paul as a son in the faith. So we know they were pretty close. Now the letter itself, the letter Titus itself, falls into the pastoral epistles, which is different than the rest of the epistles because it's written to specific individuals. It includes 1st and 2nd Timothy, Titus, and Philemon. Though really it's more 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus. Philemon kind of stands alone in some aspects, but it was written to well, first of all, it's not like the other epistles because it's, the other epistles, it almost always seemed like Paul was writing to churches that were dealing with issues, and it was issue driven. He was always addressing specific issues that needed to be responded to. So I always view the epistles as kind of being reactive on some level. It's Paul seeing a problem and trying to respond to that problem. And then it's usually assumed that letter is going to be shared with a wider audience, where with 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus, I get the sense that, these are letters that Paul was writing to friends, to his comrades, his people that he was really close to. And so I think we see a little bit more intimate style of writing. And also in both these books, you see Paul writing not so much reacting. He's not really reacting to problems. He's actually saying, hey guys, this is the way we want to do things. So it's more of a forward looking type book as opposed to a backwards looking reactionary type letter. It's more like, hey guys, this is the way we want to do things, assuming a clean slate. So it's a little bit different than the other epistles. I'd also say that Titus in particular is a book that focuses on this idea of sound doctrine and it being reflected through sound behavior. The idea that sound doctrine will lead to good behavior, proper behavior, which is kind of interesting in some ways because much of the chapter 1, which we're about to read, you'll see Paul is dealing with legalism, the first century legalism, which focused around this Judaizer group that was wanting to make all the Christians kind of half Jewish, and so it's kind of interesting because, we think of legalists being focused on sound doctrine. They're very, very locked in on doing everything the specific right way. And that's really what Titus is about. But I think it shows where Paul makes a big point to show where that focus on sound doctrine should be, as opposed to maybe some of the things that we sometimes get bound up in. And I think you'll see that as we proceed forward in Titus. Okay, let's get started with a reading. Terry, Lucretia, I don't know who is going to read it, but if you could read verses 1-4 to start us off, I would appreciate that.
Sure. Paul, a servant of God and an apostle of Jesus Christ, to further the faith of God's elect and their knowledge of the truth that leads to godliness, in the hope of eternal life, which God, who does not lie, promised before the beginning of time, and which now, at his appointed season, he is brought to light through the preaching entrusted to me by the command of God our Savior. To Titus, my true son, in our common faith, grace and peace from God the Father and Christ Jesus our Savior.
Paul?
Sure. For this reason, I left you in Crete, that you would set in order what remains and appoint elders in every city as I directed you. Namely, if any man is above reproach, the husband of one wife, having children who believe, not accused of dissipation or rebellion, for the overseer must be above reproach as God's steward, not self-willed, not quick-tempered, not addicted to wine, not pugnacious, not fond of sordid gain, but hospitable, loving what is good, sensible, just, devout, self-controlled, holding fast the faithful word which is in accordance with the teaching, so that he will be able to both exhort in sound doctrine and to refute those who contradict.
For there are many rebellious people, full of meaningless talk and deception, especially those of circumcision group. They must be silenced because they are disrupting whole households by teaching things they ought not to teach, and that for the sake of dishonest gain. One of Crete's own prophets has said it: Cretans are always liars, evil brutes, and lazy gluttons. This saying is true. Therefore, rebuke them sharply so that they will be sound in the faith and will pay no attention to Jewish myths or to the merely human commands of those who reject the truth. To the pure, all things are pure, but to those who are corrupted and do not believe, nothing is pure. In fact, both their minds and conscience are corrupted. They claim to know God, but by their actions, they deny him. They are detestable, disobedient, and unfit for doing anything good.
Okay, thank you, guys. That's chapter 1 of Titus. I want to just briefly touch on verse 1. We're not going to spend a lot of time on the introduction, but I wanted to touch briefly on verse 1. It says, I read the NIV, and I think, Terry, that's what you had, but it said, Paul, a servant of God and an apostle of Jesus Christ, to further the faith of God's elect and their knowledge of the truth that leads to godliness. Paul always is worried about his credentials. He's always trying to establish who he is, which it's hard for us to understand today because he's Paul, right? I mean, he's like Paul, and short of Jesus, I don't know anybody that is probably more prominent to Christians in the New Testament. I mean, Paul's Paul. But we have to remember, to the people he's writing to and the people that we're going to be reading these letters, he was also Paul, who was not one of the apostles that lived with Jesus, that walked with Jesus, did all these things. He instead was somebody who came in later and obviously had the road to Damascus experience, which establishes any credentials, as far as a calling you might want to argue about. But he's kind of late to the game. So I always get the feeling he's a little touchy about that, and he wants to make sure everybody acknowledges that. Paul?
Yeah, he's Yeah, I'm teaching Romans in my Thursday morning neighborhood men's Bible class, and so there's a lot of tie points between Titus and Romans, actually. One of the things that in all the background studying I'm doing is not only were they accusing him, or not only were they saying you need to be circumcised, you need to adopt the dietary laws, you need to adopt the cleanliness laws, you need to do all the festivals, you need to do, present yourselves to Jerusalem 3 times a year on the pilgrimages, all these things. It's Jesus, it's grace plus works. And Paul is saying no upon no upon no for many books, many letters, that it's faith alone, it's grace, it's not works. It's grace plus anything else is nothing. And what the Judaizers, besides teaching you got to be a proselytized Jew to be a true Christian, they're also saying, hey, this guy's teaching an easy gospel. He's teaching an easy gospel, so it's too good to be true, so it's not true. And so they're doing some things, discrediting him wherever they are. These people are traveling because of commerce all over the Mediterranean basin, and so they are taking their Judaized Christian belief with them, and they're going into these groups and saying, hey, you guys, you heard from this Paul guy. This Paul guy is teaching a false gospel. Oh, it's prolific.
And as you read through the epistles, it's a common theme. I mean, he was dealing with this issue with the Judaizers over and over again, and it wasn't something that just went away with the decision of the elders and the church leaders in Jerusalem. It was something that was being shared. And you got to remember, they didn't communicate the same way we do today, where, you put something on Twitter and everybody knows it immediately. It took a while for the word to get out. So it gave a lot of these people an opportunity to really gain a foothold in their corruption of the gospel with these new Christians. Now, the thing, though, that I wanted to kind of catch in that verse 1 is he says he's a servant of God and an apostle of Jesus Christ to further the faith of God's elect and their knowledge of the truth that leads to godliness. That sounds like equipping for all good works. It sounds like training up that next generation, preparing the church, helping them gain in their faith, helping them gain in their knowledge of the truth, because knowledge of truth leads to godliness. And so I see Paul, establishing one of his purposes as an apostle is to equip that next generation, to help grow the church internally by making them better Christians. Paul?
Well, I totally agree with you on that, Jason. He's a teacher and a very good one. And so he is, as you say, he is equipping. He's also helping folks in their faith walk to, hey, these fruits of the Spirit, come as the Spirit is living in you and now is exhibiting itself in your life. It's that walk you're taking. I think Paul gets. I know me growing up in the congregation I grew up in, and the other members of that other congregations of that non-class brotherhood. Paul was used as a hammer and an anvil on thou shalt. It's what you're against versus what you are or what you're for. And so I'm glad that over the course of time and kind of changing brotherhoods, if you will, that getting more into the message of grace and what he's really teaching versus just using him as a hammer. So a lot of us come from different backgrounds that have been in the Church of Christ for a long time, or if we're a new Christian, we really haven't studied it and we really can't understand, well, why is this a problem? But it comes down to look at all the groups around the world all of them have a works basis. And so that has spilled into Christian groups as well. You've got to do these things in order to, be saved. Versus, no, it's grace, and you let the Spirit come into you, and your life changes. You are now a different person. You're going to be living differently, and these are the ways that it will be manifested in your life. And so he's teaching people this, and remember, they're coming from all of the. It's still true today. Religion hasn't changed. It's either God's or it's man's. And in man's, it's always, I've got to appease this God in order for me to be successful in my world. And so they're always appeasing. They're trying not to have the wrath of their God come down on them. And so these folks are coming from that background, and folks still are today. And so the works thing, people believe I've got to have works in order to save myself, because Christ isn't enough. That's kind of what's being taught to folk. And so he's trying to help them realize that's not true.
Well, and it's interesting because I do think when we get into chapter 2, you'll start to see that when he's talking about sound doctrine, he's not really focused on, taking the Lord's Supper every Sunday. He's not focused on, a song, a prayer, 2 songs, the Lord's Supper, a song. That's not what sound doctrine is.
Yes, no.
It's a wholesome living. It's a blameless lifestyle, and it's not focused on those doctrinal issues or what we call doctrinal issues so often today, especially in our heritage as Church of Christ.
I think when he talks about truth, I don't think the definition of his truth is as wide as our definition of truth. And I think that's what you kind of said a second ago. I think the truth that he's more focused on is the truth and knowledge of Jesus Christ. And so when he talks about the truth and acknowledgement, I think he's talking. There is good in truth, because if it's God's truth, then it is the right truth, and it is good for our spirits. But I think that truth, what he talks about, is the truth that is acknowledging who Jesus is. And it is that truth that acknowledges Jesus that leads into practicing out faith, living out faith, is what creates this wholesome person, this holistic person in the image of Jesus. And so I wish that somehow we could get back to, or at least get to a point where we understand that when Scripture talks about truth, it is not talking about the big definition that we tend to have. In fact, I don't want to take away the class, but in fact, Paul touches on some of those things when he starts accusing the Jews of myths and all these other things that they start, because the Jews believe truth, but they also believe other parts that truth also had other parts, and it would embellish truth, and sort of like we tend to do. We know the truth, but we embellish it with other things that we believe ought to be truth, but they're not really God's truth.
Yeah, I think sometimes we're not wowed enough by the idea of the truth being the gospel of
The death, burial, resurrection.
Of Jesus, the death, burial, and resurrection. I don't think we're wowed enough by that. And so we think there's got to be something more. And as a result, we start trying to add more and more layers to that truth. Now, I will say this. I disagree a little bit from the standpoint that I think the bigger truth that we talk about, and this is a semantics game, but the bigger truth we talk about is really much smaller than that smaller truth that is the actual truth, and so I don't want to diminish the power and the big T truth that is Jesus Christ and him crucified, to quote 1 Corinthians.
I think you hit the nail on the head, that sometimes we're not in awe of the simplicity of the gospel and the message of Jesus. that we have to wow ourselves into being wowed, and so I think that's human nature. They did it in the first century too, and so it's always that battle, that inner battle within ourselves to get back to the simplicity of Jesus instead of we it's been done for centuries. People are people.
Yeah, I think we are tempted to try to manufacture that sense of awe, when really just the simple idea of Christ and what that sacrifice was, what he gave up coming to earth, whether it's reading, Philippians chapter 2, right? Where it talks about leaving heaven and coming to earth as a man. And the power of that story is something that should be sufficient, but I do think oftentimes we struggle for other things. Okay. I do want to move on because we're going to talk about, I want to move on to chapter 5, or verse 5, not chapter 5. Titus doesn't have 5 chapters. Testing you to see if you're paying attention. Verse 5, let me ask you, when we read Paul talking to Titus, he's saying, I left you behind for the unfinished business. And it seems like the first priority of that unfinished business is the appointment of elders in all the towns around Crete. Now, when we read all of chapter 1, we get an idea. Why was it so critical to Paul that these elders be appointed in each of these towns? What was it that Paul was wanting to make sure these churches had by the appointment of the elders?
Well, I mean, Cretans have always been a pretty. If I talk over you, please, put your finger up so I'll know and to cut my thought. I don't want to jump over Terry or Lucretia or Paul, but Cretans were pretty. I mean, Paul mentions it later on. They were pretty. They were. By the way, Paul was quoting one of their own philosophers when he called them gluttons and liars and all that. But they've always been very outgoing, loud people. They still are today. They're very kind salt of the earth, but they've always been loud people, and so they were very independent. And so during that era, elders was not just a New Testament thought or an Old Testament. Elders had existed for hundreds and even thousands of years in all, not only in Judaism, but in all around them. And so Paul understood that if there's going to be order in this new church, in this new establishment, then he must get this elder leadership in place in order to help this church. And what does he say? So that you may put in order what was left unfinished. And so I think part of that is they were rudderless, and you have to give them a sense of direction, and elders were to do that.
Okay, Terry?
Yeah, it occurs to me that these are new Christians that are
very new,
that had left a structure of religion in the past. Paul kind of alluded to, a lot of us have come from a very structured black and white laws, truths, big T's, little t's. That was our structure in the past. If we were brand new Christians, and ones that are brand new Christians need to have someone to guide them, to lead them, and where they did rely in the past on the structure that was there. They knew that this was the law, this is how you did things, whether it's circumcision or these myths that are alluded to. They're coming into a brand new world, and he's trying to make sure that he doesn't leave them floundering, not knowing what the real gospel is, not knowing that importance that should be right there.
I'm not advocating this, but think about that. So from the time Paul left Titus there to the time Paul writes Titus again, to establish elders, was about how many years?
I don't know. I couldn't find a clear timeline.
So it showed maybe around 3 years. Around 3 years from the time Paul visited Crete or left Titus there and the time that Paul wrote him again. I believe it was about 3 years. So imagine that, 3-year-old elders.
Let me interrupt you though, because on the day of Pentecost, at the first gospel sermon, they do reference the fact that there were Cretans there that heard that sermon. So we do have, before we call them too much of a baby, they probably had almost, I don't know, at this point it would have been more than, it probably would have been a couple of decades almost of time from the day of Pentecost to this time. So there would have been some, I don't want to call them mature Christians, but people who had been Christians for a while. But that doesn't change that your point's valid.
No, they were. I mean, so the Cretans that heard the message in Acts are probably some of the same the Cretans that you read about now that were adding on to the gospel. They were changing the gospel. And so Paul had to rely on other people that weren't there in Acts to right the ship, if you will. And I suspect those people were the ones he relied more on the younger ones, because it's the ones that had been there for a while that were, at least in my view, that were creating the chaos.
That is definitely a potential reality. Paul, do you have something?
Yeah, I was trying to, like you guys, trying to work through the timeline in my head, because, when he's being transported to Rome for his, trial before Caesar, they end up in Crete. That's where he gets snake bit and he survives that. And so I don't know what the timeline is from there to this point, which is in between imprisonments, if I'm not mistaken. And so it's been, I think like Victor said, for his presence is probably in and out for, 2, 3, 4 years, somewhere in that range. But as I said a few minutes ago, you have had people that have been in Jerusalem for the festivals that were exposed to Christianity and believed. And that happened on the day of Pentecost, and it's been happening ever since. And they're going back out to wherever they were, because they are the dispersed, Jews from the Assyrian captivity, and they keep moving around. And they call that the diaspora, the dispersion. Right. And so they're out there, and so it's been around. How long, don't know. But they are, newer, but
well, and let me say this, based off my study, most people don't believe that when he was shipwrecked on Crete, that's, the first time that's not when he was doing any preaching anything. He was just there and went through. Most people believe his first time as far as establishing churches was in between the two imprisonments in Rome. And so it would have been during that time frame that this book was written. I want to say it was around 60 AD, somewhere in that ballpark. So if you've got some Cretans that brought Christianity from the day of Pentecost back to Crete, you're still looking, like I said, a couple of decades, a solid period of time that had passed where there would have been some that were more mature. But when I read this, getting back to my original question, when you look at why Paul is wanting Titus to make sure they have elders, it was to protect the church from these false teachers. It was to protect the church from these Judaizers that were coming around. It wasn't just the Judaizers, in fairness. There were some other people that fell into this category, but the elders were being appointed to provide guidance and to help steer the ship through the dangers, the rocks, of these false teachers that could very easily lead astray new Christians and people that don't have that firm foundation in the gospel. Paul?
It's succession planning. I mean, that's what, you go from Jesus to the apostles to now you have the elder-led churches. I mean, that's just the way that the Lord laid it out there. And what they didn't know and what we still don't know today is how long will the church age last? I imagine they were probably thinking he's coming any day. I'm listening for trumpets daily, but I haven't heard one. But I still listen for him every day. So the church age, I think, has lasted longer than anyone at that time probably could have imagined. But it's succession planning, and you have to take the apostles, or when Jesus told them at Caesarea Philippi, looking there at the temple of Pan and the gates of Hades and all that, upon this rock I'll establish the church. Whatever you bind will be bound, whatever you unbind will be unbound. And so he's given them the keys to the kingdom. So the apostles have that responsibility of setting things up, as they go out to the world, as they were, told to do, and we are today. But getting the elders set up, that happened in Jerusalem very quickly. So if you want to talk about newly minted Christians, that was very quick in Jerusalem. And I'm sure that the elders the Ephesian elders that met Paul at Miletus on his way back from Corinth back to Rome, they probably hadn't been elders very long either, and probably hadn't been Christians very long either. So it's not a new thing. And so, it was the progression of Christianity in the known world was going at an amazing rate. And with that, you have to have a succession plan, and the elder process is what the apostles established to move forward. And so we're still doing it today.
And I think it's interesting, though, the parallel here in Titus with what you see in Acts chapter 20, when Paul's addressing the elders there. What does he warn them against? He talks about how there'll be what?
It's talking about false teachers coming in and leading them astray. And so you got to have like I think Victor said a moment ago, you have to have a rudder that says, no, we're going north, and north is this way, and this isn't correct. These people are spreading a false gospel, and someone has to stand in the gap and say no, and keep folks in the right gospel, the only gospel. And so if you went somewhere today and planted churches, say in a third world country, before that mission effort left, I'm sure that you would be trying your best to help them appoint elders among themselves to do exactly that. No matter how new they were, some folks assimilate faster than others. I'll give you an example. Paul was only in Thessalonica for 3 weeks, yet he's writing a letter to them at some point in time thereafter, because they were worried that they missed their rapture. They thought they missed it. And they were saying, we're in the tribulation now. Why weren't we raptured? And Paul said, wait a minute. Rapture hadn't come yet because the man of lawlessness has not appeared yet. And so he was there 3 weeks, but he's already talking to them about the end times. And so, wow, I didn't hear about the end times until about like 3 years ago. I'm dead serious, because we don't teach it. Paul taught it in the first 3 weeks of these people's lives as Christians. And so that just,
we don't teach it,
blowing to me.
But we don't teach it because it hasn't happened. And what I mean by that is everything had a sense of urgency to them. And now we're 2,000 years later, and there's kind of this like settled in feel. And it's one of our biggest obstacles as a Christians, right? Is we've just kind of settled in, and we're on cruise control. And I think we have to work on getting that urgency back. Let me say this though. The reason I wanted to focus on that is, we're in the elder process right now. And when you look at what are we looking for in elders, one of the things that we have to acknowledge and we have to see is what is the function of an elder? What is the purpose of an elder? What is it that they are supposed to help us do as sheep in the flock? And it's obvious that one of the primary, if not the primary, is to guide the church through these false, the dangers of false doctrine, the danger of false teaching, those types of issues. Because again, that seems to be what's motivating Paul with Titus. You see it over in 1 Timothy too, when it's talked about. And then you see it back in Acts chapter 20, when he's getting ready to leave and he's giving this farewell address to the elders there. He's warning them to be on their guard against these false teachers. So I think it's important that when we look at, chapter verses 5 through 9, the quote unquote qualifications, that we keep in mind what it is that the elders were supposed to be doing, and what their responsibilities were going to be, because it gives us a better understanding of what is meant in those characteristics, those qualifications that are listed out in 6, 7, and 8 of Titus. Now, I think at this point we've been going about 41 minutes. And that being said, that means we're getting really close to the end. So I think it would be wrong of us to rush through this next section dealing with the elders and the qualifications or characteristics or whatever you want to discuss, or whatever you want to call them. But as a preamble to next week, where we'll talk a little bit more in detail about this, I want to tell you, this is very much a hot button issue still within the church. How do we deal with these characteristics of an elder? Do we treat them as bright line qualifications? Do we treat them as kind of, just general characteristics that we're looking for? Are we looking for a really, really good Christian? Or do we just kind of throw them out because nobody could possibly live up to these standards and we just do the best we can? And I will tell you that this came home to me very much this week. I was with, I say this week, you'll find that I say yesterday or this week generically when it was really like a month ago.
That's
But
what my granddaughter does.
Right. No, Shauna gets crazy because I say stuff like, today, and I really mean like 6 weeks ago, but it was really last week. But I was sitting down with a solid group of Christian men, and we were talking, and there was a dispute when we talked about this, this very scripture. There was one person who believed very adamantly that this is qualifications, that it is a bright line requirement, that you have to, that an elder needs to have all these qualities. And there was another who felt more like it was kind of a portrait, but generically of what an elder might look like. And I think it is something that we all struggle with on some level. Part of it is our natural humility. I mean, we look at this list of traits, and most of us go, man, I can't live up to that. And we look at and we go, who does live up to that? Because we live in a critical society. We live in a society that tends to identify and enumerate the faults of people more than we identify and enumerate the virtues of people. We tend to tear people down more than we build them up, right? So when we look at this list, we're like, man, how hard is it to find somebody who does that? The danger of doing that is, this is Jason's perspective, okay? And this is what we're going to end on. And I hate to do this to you guys, but come back next week because we're going to get into a deeper discussion. And I want to hear what you guys have to say. I'm going to tell you, I grew up believing this was a list of qualifications. In fact, in church, I had to memorize as a third, fourth, fifth, sixth grader. I don't remember which year it was. I had to memorize both the First Timothy list and the Titus list. And I had to be able to say that there's only a slight difference, but there is a difference. I had to be able to identify that difference. I got a plaque for being able to do it, along with several other things. But I no longer probably believe that it is a list of qualifications, okay? In the sense that you have to sit here and check off these things as you read them. But that is not to say in any way that I diminish my expectations of who should be an elder, okay? That's not to say I diminish those in any way. It just means that I think it's too simplistic to say this is a list of qualifications. I think you have to look at the person, look at the broader concept, because twice in Titus, he says, an elder must be above reproach. Okay? He says that twice. I think that is the general characteristic that a lot of these things fall under. Is an elder somebody who people can't really just attack for being bad, for being weak, for not, they have to manufacture things to tear that person down because this person doesn't have those, this man doesn't have those, weaknesses that are obvious, those foibles that would cause him to be torn down.
And Titus, the Titus and qualifications he's giving, the very first ones after blameless, they're all attributes that Cretans were known for.
Okay.
So you needed to select men that were counter to those characteristics. And
look, here's the thing. I do believe elders are the exceptional among us. And I almost hate saying that because I know immediately how that's taken. But I do think that the expectation is that elders are those that have progressed and are further along in their journey, to that ultimate goal, and are people who have went further down that path. And it's not always in time, but it's in maturity as a Christian. Okay. Now, obviously, I think today we're looking at a different selection pool than they were then, because we've already talked about it. We have people, we have generations upon generations upon generations of church, and we've got more history to draw on, which immediately starts us at a different location than these people were starting in the first century. So I think in a lot of ways, we're in a different place than they were. And so I think that colors how we select our elders. At that time, it looks like Titus was picking them, so the equivalent of that today would be having Mick pick them, that would kind of be the closest thing that we would have, or have the existing elders pick them. But that's not always the way these things are done. Okay, look, I'm out of time, and I'm just running out of time.